Welcome to SoCal with Val, your guide to the best of Southern California living. Today is a really extra show because we're joined by someone who's not only a wine expert, but we think of him as a wine whisperer. Now, before you say, I don't even drink wine, just hold on, stick with me, because today's show is not just about wine. So don't turn the channel, stick with us. It's about a story, culture, craftsmanship, and the people who pour their hearts into making something that's really special. Wine really is like music. It's like art. It's kind of like farming. And it's rolled into the land. It's shaped by history and crafted by real people who care deeply about what they do. And I think that was my first real attraction about wine, was when I was charged with the responsibility of pricing it for a charity auction. And I started looking it up, and I realized that every hillside, every winemaker, every type of grape, every year was all different. And I found it so fascinating that for me, drinking wine is much more than just the grape itself. People think, oh, I like reds. I mean, that's not even the beginning of the story. So no one tells the story better than our guest and show sponsor, Kyle Meyer, who's the president and co-owner of Wine Exchange. He's tested over, are you ready for this, 80,000 wines, no pun intended, traveled the world's most iconic wine regions, and he loves to share his insights on media. He's co-founded one of the most popular wine websites out there, but he's one of the nicest, most down-to-earth educators you'll ever meet. So whether you're a seasoned sipper or you're just wine curious like many of us, Kyle was going to make you feel right at home. Today, we're going to explore a fascinating wine region, one that isn't exactly in Southern California, but it's in California, and we drink it in Southern California, so that counts. We're going to uncover what makes the land and the grapes so unique, and we're going to hear Kyle's top recommendations for Father's Day, plus a few stories that might just make you change the way you think of wine. So pour your favorite beverage, whether it's coffee, tea, sparkling water, or wine, and join us for a conversation that's all about passion, place, and the magic of making something and enjoying something and appreciating something that's really meaningful. Kyle, welcome again to SoCal with Val.
Hello, Val. How's it going?
Good, good, good. We are so glad to have you back.
Happy to be back.
As with any time, what always fascinates me, I can never get enough time with you, Kyle Meyer. Wherever we are, anybody even mentions the word red, white, or wine, and you have just an abundance of knowledge. No one can even imagine how much you know and how depth your knowledge is about the world of wine. And really, I think of the history of wine, not just in years, but all that comes with it. And you know all of that, I mean, just more than anybody can even imagine.
Well, wine is history. It's an integral part of it. Thousands of years, 2,000 years, 3,000 years. The Romans, the Cistercian monks, the modern history. It all kind of plays in, and it's always kind of there. Other things come in and out of history, but wine has always remained. The joy of wine, the spirit of wine, the conviviality of wine, the quality of wine, the different flavors, characters, etc. And I don't think it goes away for that reason. It's always going to be cool to somebody. Yeah, and wine's very cool to me. So.
Yep. Well, and you think about even in Bible times, Jesus turned the water into wine, so it must have been something that was already going on, right?
Well, wine was Thomas Jefferson, that you've seen that quote on the back of some of the wine bottles, great wine is a necessity of life for me. There's a famous Thomas Jefferson quote. But the thing is, back in those days, when you're talking like 1,000 years ago, 500 even years ago, wine was a necessity, just like beer was. I mean, think about it. Water was bad. Think about it. So water was bad. It was tainted. You could get more sick from water than you could from drinking beer. Like the monks were heavy into beer as well, ales, fermented ales, etc. The foundation of it was water. So basically, they could drink water, they could hydrate, have fun doing it, and not
Yeah.
die from it. So it was kind of, wine and beer and all these sorts of things were pretty much staples. When you got into heavier spirits, that's when things went a little sideways. Whiskey and that kind of stuff. You couldn't necessarily classify those particular types of beverages in that kind of genre, but really, wine and beer was a necessity for a lot of people in a lot of parts of the world for a very long time.
And did they, in those days, did they ferment it in barrels and
Yeah, well, yeah, back in the days, well, going way back, they would ferment it in. They would literally dig out the concrete. I've seen places in Spain, old Roman, just big pits that they dug out of concrete or out of the mountainside, and they would do the fermentation and everything literally on the side of the mountain. They chipped out a hole in the mountain, and that's where the grapes went. And then they chipped away little canals from one section to the other, so they have the fermentation in one spot, and then the wine would be transferred to another spot. And so basically, they dug out the sides of mountains, just pure granite. This was something that was quite common back in the old days. And then, in Eastern Europe, in those areas, they started developing, amphora. Amphora never left us. The amphora were there with the Greeks and the Romans and such. It was a vessel for transporting. It was a vessel for fermenting. It was a vessel for storing. It was a vessel for all of that. So those terracotta, those clay amphora, were also were very intrinsic in the development of fine wine and storage of fine wine, and your wine didn't go bad, and a lot of it was stored underground in these amphora. They would dig the amphora into the ground and fill them, etc., and to just pull the wine from the ground as needed. So they had a way of storing it however they could and creating it however they could. Human beings are pretty darn resourceful when it comes to stuff like that.
yeah, yep, yeah, yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
So where do you think that I mean, do you think they thought so much about growing grapes at that time, or was it just pretty much wine? Like,
I think they did think about growing grapes. Going there were set established vineyards 2,000 years ago. Wine was a big deal. It was probably more structured than you might want to think. It wasn't so caveman. When you think about the Romans and the Greeks, they had mathematics, they had written language, they
yeah,
had
that's true.
technology. So no, there were vineyards planted specifically. And back in the Roman times, they had 100 years or whatever to figure out what grew best where. So that process was already taking place. And the Romans and the Greeks, they all had their favorite wines. Whether it was falernum, whether it was and these wines were talked about in a lot of the poetry and songs and books from the great philosophers. These wines were mentioned by name, and so there was already a great wine culture. There was a Chateau Margaux or a Screaming Eagle, back 2,000 years ago. It had a different name, but
Yeah.
there were still labels. There were still very popular wines at the time.
And of course, there was a lot of wine in the church, right?
Oh, of course, yeah.
Not
The
only
church,
for enjoyment, but also as a part of the ceremony. So,
yeah,
yeah,
the Holy Communion, all of this played into it, and well, I don't know if I want to go there, but I'm not the most terribly religious person, but hey, having a little wine at church, you know, hey,
yeah,
welcome to church.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
You
yeah,
know, um, that whole vibe, because especially when you think about it, when Christianity first began, they were recruiting, right?
yeah.
When you're starting a religion from nothing, or the foundations, or the a base foundation of Judaism or an offshoot of Judaism, whatever. I don't want to get too much into theology, but at that time you're recruiting, and if you want people to have a good time in your house, pour them a glass of wine.
Entertain them. Sure you do.
Yeah, exactly,
Yeah, absolutely.
exactly.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah,
very
very,
true.
very interesting. And of course they had the shout, not the shout, that's not the right word. The goblets, right? So there
Yep.
was,
Oh, the
right,
chalices. Yeah, yeah,
chalices, right? Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So we know that because we see those, right, from those
Yeah.
times. We see it.
It was a very important part of the culture, and
Yeah.
still is when you think
So how
about it.
fun. So Kyle, you have tasted over 80,000 wines. Is that
Mhm.
true?
Yeah, you figure, yeah, maybe even more. I don't know. I don't know,
And
probably figure 3 to 5,000 wines a year over the last 30 years. Yeah, you're Could be 100,000. I don't keep hard count. Yeah,
You
I
don't
put a
think
number
so?
up there on LinkedIn so people can have a little perspective on it. But we taste a lot of wine and spit a lot of wine. We don't get to keep all of it, you know.
No, no.
If I did, I'd be dead. So
Remember the first one that really caught your attention?
interesting. Yeah. You always have some epiphany wines, and the first wine that really caught my attention was a wine from the late Terry Layton at Kalin Cellars, Kalin. The winery's defunct now, but it was a super cool cult winery at the time in the '80s into the '90s. Really enjoyed a great heyday, and I had a Pinot Noir from him when I was maybe 17 years old. And at the time, I was working at that gourmet grocery store, and that was a bottle that my boss gave to me to take home. Snuck it to me so I could take home and try it. And that wine really left a mark on me. And that was the first bottle of wine. That Pinot Noir was just like so aromatic and fragrant and silky and glossy. You weren't drinking wine as I knew it. You were drinking, like because my folks drank jug wine, Almaden and this kind of stuff, and when you snuck a little bit of those
That's
Almaden,
a name from the past.
yeah, the Almaden and the Carlo Rossi, and when you're like 16 and you're sneaking little tastes of those, and then you go to a scenario where you have a wine like the Kalin 1981 Cuvée DD Pinot Noir, that you're going into hyperspace. It's like Star Wars. You're going from your little land speeder, and then you get shot into hyperspace, and that's what happened to me. And that was at the dinner table, just having the wine, and I was like, wow. And I was really fortunate to try a lot of great wines very early on in my career. When I was in my teens, I
Yeah.
tried so many great wines, and so I had wonderful perspective early on. But that Kalin one, that's the first one that kind of shook my boat, as well as those great German Rieslings. I was fortunate to have a lot of great German Riesling from J.J. Prum and Dr. Tanisch and these very famous producers back when I was in my teens, and those wines lit me up pretty good too, I gotta say. Beautiful.
And along with that, you've traveled to so many wine growing regions. What's one place that really changed how you saw wine?
Oh man, that's a good question. How I saw wine, you know, because I'd been to the point of our conversation later on today. I'd already been to Napa earlier, but I guess the first spot where I was like, "Are you kidding?" Was Germany, and that's because we talked. There's this concept called heroic viticulture, where you literally have to be a hero, a legend, a rock star to work these vineyards. They're so difficult to work. And I remember getting to Germany and going down the Mosel, and these vineyards are at slopes of like 60, 70%. The vineyards are almost near vertical.
Yeah.
And I remember going up in these vineyards, and I'm like, how does this happen? How do you do this? This isn't like potato farming, a big field and you got this machine. And no, this is artisan, vine by vine, dangerous viticulture. I mean, these people could slip, they could fall. The ground is covered with all these bits of crumbly shale. And I was up in this vineyard, I'm like, and the wine that comes from this vineyard sells for $20 a bottle. And I was like, wow, like the work you're putting in here in this site, the danger, and the beauty,
Yeah.
gorgeous vineyards. And I was like, wow, wine is really next level. Just what some people do to produce world-class wine is amazing and is indeed heroic. So probably Germany, probably around 2000, because I'd been to Italy, I'd been to Australia before that, but those vineyards were kind of like straight up. You know what I mean? It was a lot of, oh, maybe a little hillside, oh, maybe a little something, something. And yeah, I'd say Germany. And I took an early trip to Spain in the mid 90s. I was in Priorat in Spain, and same type of deal. These steep hillsides, meager, no vines, meager yields, and the effort and work put in just to make a few bottles of wine was remarkable to me. And after that, I respected the farmers and the vignerons much, much more.
Absolutely. And when you say it's a labor of love, right? I mean, it actually is. It has to be.
It is. It is. These folks, great vignerons, great winemakers, and grape growers. They wake up thinking wine. They spend all day thinking wine, and they go to sleep thinking wine. This is it's well, actually, they think vineyard. The top guys
Yeah.
90% of the time, they get up in the morning thinking vineyard, afternoon vineyard, evening vineyard. And then like for 10% of the year, for 1 month, they're thinking wine because they have to push all this beautiful raw materials that they created and worked their butts off over the course of a year. And they get that into the cellar, and then you only have one shot at it. You have
Yeah.
one shot.
Yeah.
You can't mess it up. You you have to be perfect. Especially if think about it, you put in, 11 months and 28 days into a day. It has to
Yeah.
be perfect. There's no margin for error. So they have to switch, they have to put on their new caps real quick and figure out the barrels and the tanks and everything so they can not ruin what they took a year to cultivate.
No, and it's interesting. When I was in college, my roommate happened to be a farmer's daughter, but I
Hmm.
really didn't think about it. I
Hmm.
grew up in a small town and there were farms around us, but I really didn't think as a farmer. And one day it rained a
Hmm.
lot, and
Yep.
her comment, and we were all complaining about the rain, and her comment was, "Oh my gosh, the effect it had on the soybeans."
Yep. Yep.
Right. And I'll
Whether.
never forget that day. Her name was Marge Edwards. I still follow her on Facebook.
Mhm.
And what I realized that day is what that meant to the farmers,
Mhm.
right? And really, you're like that. You're exactly right. It's the wine, it's the grapes. We were in Italy one year, and one of those hillsides was going straight up, and
Mhm.
it was a man picking grapes who had an LA Lakers hat on.
Go
And
Lakers.
he pointed to it. He said, Kobe Bryant, right?
Bill, I got to tell you, I had that moment too in the wine business. I was in Austria one year and tasting with a dynamite Austrian producer, one of the best in the country. And we were inside tasting, and you heard some thunder and such, et cetera, et cetera. And then you heard rain, which okay, rain, but then you heard tick tack, tickety tack, hail,
Oh,
which
yeah.
hail is the absolute. That is the complete panic zone for winemakers and grape growers. Hail is the worst. In
Yeah.
20 minutes, you could be out of business.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget looking at the fear on his face. When we started hearing the rain was one thing, but the tic tac, it was like his ears pointed up, his eyes got real big, and he ran outside. And because literally, it can happen that fast, Val. 30 minutes of hail, and you're out of business. You have no income for an entire year.
Yeah.
Mother Nature, incredible. Ugh, scary.
Yeah.
Mm,
Yeah. It is pretty scary.
mm.
So we know you as being very approachable, a great conversationalist, and so willing to share your knowledge. Is And there are a lot of people that know a lot about wine, but everybody isn't as open and as friendly and as giving as you are. Is that something intentional? Like, did you decide, oh, I always want to share this, or is it just your wonderful personality?
Well, thank you. Probably a little bit of both. I'm not a mean person,
No,
and
you're not.
and the thing is, to me, you know, and here's the deal: at the start of your career, you tend to be insulative, and you tend to want to keep information, and you tend to want to store it, and then later on in your career is when you think about the sustainability of the business. You think about sharing. You think about releasing that information. And for me, I started very early, so my information release actually came much sooner. So I was in my 30s and I was already wanting to share. So I think that was a big part of it, because um, how do I put this nicely? The wine business has a lot of people in the business that um, I call it I know something you don't know,
Yeah.
right? And the people that know about wine, they know it's a potentially interesting category to some folks, but they do want to lord that over you. That's their one little stitch of power that they have. And so it's like, oh, well, you don't know about that. Or, oh, well, you don't know, da da da. Or, oh, well, that's impossible. I couldn't tell you that in a, da, da, da. And to me, that's no, 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 no. For the sustainability of the business, for the future of the wine business, you have to share. You have to get more people involved. You have to create. You have to grow the business. And the business was inclined for a very long time. The sommeliers and a lot of retailers, that would just there's that moment where they had an ounce of power over someone that might be more affluent than them or more influential than them, or you know what I mean? Like, oh, the shoe's on the other foot. You're the rock star, but I got you now. You're in my house, right? And I think there was that pervading philosophy in the wine business for a very long time. And I think it still pervades with some people to a certain extent, the whole kind of like faux snobby appeal of wine. You know, wine's fermented grape juice. But the faux snobby wine appeal of wine is still it's still out there because a lot of people, their business kind of depends on it. It depends on their retention of knowledge and then dispersing it to you as needed for their profit. So I get that, but that's never been my jam. Never, never. I've
No.
always been very sharing.
No, and if you were not, and I've told this story before, I think, but one day I walked into your store. I'm not sure you were even really open yet. The first day I
Mhm,
came in, and Tristan
mhm,
was at the front of the store, came out to talk to me.
mhm.
And you were so nice that then I mean, just completely changed my outlook on wine, and that you were so approachable and you were so nice. And if I needed something, you would talk about it, you would tell us about it, and was yeah, it's just pretty amazing. You don't get that when you go into normal wine stores.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no,
But
it's
you're not normal. We know that already.
yeah, sharing is caring, man. You know, like it, how does it help me for you not to have information? You know, my thought process has always been make my friends and customers smarter so that they drink better wine. And it's not necessarily so they drink more expensive wine. That's not what it's about. It's about drinking better wine. You know, drinking something that's $20 but could sell for 50, not drinking a $300 wine and tell everybody, oh, look at the $300 wine I'm drinking. To me, that's not the wine business. I don't like that part of the business. And on Instagram and these sorts of things, you see people posting just all these bottles of Romanée-Conti and Petrus and blah, 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 blah. It's like that, how does that help the wine business? It
Right.
sets the wine business back.
Yes.
And so to me, it's, you know, I want a great website where people are posting great $15 bottles or $18 bottles. You know, that's going to help the wine business, not the, yeah.
Well, the other thing is it's probably fair to say, and this goes into our region we're going to talk about, probably fair to say that the majority of people do not have your level of wine knowledge. And
Yeah.
most of them are people like us. We want to drink nice wine. But if you talk to them in such a way that they don't even know what your time is, they say, oh, I have a great Margaux in my refrigerator. Okay, what the heck is Margaux, right? But there are
Yeah.
so many people listening to us today that and watching this, then they just want to drink wine. They just say to me,
Yeah.
Valerie, I'm in the grocery store, and I get these calls, believe it or not. Some people honestly think I know a little bit. They call me, I'm in the grocery store. I want to have a nice wine for my customer. We just closed escrow. What should I buy? And then I find myself asking, do you know what kind of wine they like? They say, of
Mhm.
course, I don't know what kind of wine they like. They're just my customer. I want to do
Ah,
something nice. So, because I've heard of a few nice names that aren't a lot of money,
mhm.
and we can help them. But those are the people who we want to talk to. We want everybody
Yeah.
listening and viewing this show to feel good about their knowledge level of wine.
Yeah.
So, let's do that.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. So, what region should we talk about first?
Well, I thought today we'd start a little bit of home team, huh? I thought we'd start with the Napa Valley. Why not?
Why
Um,
not?
yeah, it's one of the most acclaimed wine regions in the world. We can honestly say that. And it's a region with a bit of history, and it's a region that is actually a little more diverse, I think, than what a lot of people would think. So so I thought today might be fun to do a little minor deep dive into the Napa Valley and just kind of, you know, cover in a basic sense the different areas and locales within the Napa Valley, the styles of wine that they create, and kind of, you know, do a little bit of that. A little Napa 101, huh?
I
So
think that sounds great. So let's start out by defining where the Napa Valley is, because there are people who know wines that are made in the Central Coast,
mm,
right?
yeah.
So where kind of does the Napa Valley start? What is the Napa Valley area?
So the Napa Valley starts in an area called Carneros, which is the north side of the San Pablo Bay. Right. So the San Pablo Bay, we're north of San Fran. We're near like Vallejo, if you know Vallejo, this area. So you're coming out of San Fran and you're taking the East Freeway. You know, you're taking the one going north, but coming out of the east side,
Right. Yeah.
through Oakland and up through Hercules and this kind of deal. You're
Okay.
heading up, maybe the 80 or something. You're heading up that highway and you're kind of going past Vallejo or through Vallejo. Then you hang a left, right? And then as you get to the north part of the San Pablo Bay, you'll start bumping into the Carneros region of the Napa Valley. And Carneros is very distinctive because Carneros is an east-west AVA, agricultural, American viticultural area. And it's an east-west part of it. So half of it, the east side of Carneros is in Napa, and the west side of it is in Sonoma. So it's kind of cut down the middle. And so, but as you come into the valley, the first part you see is Carneros, as you're going past the San Pablo Bay, and you'll see the Carneros region. Now, this is the
So,
coolest.
so is Sonoma Napa?
No, no,
Okay.
Sonoma's separate, and Sonoma and Napa are divided by Comus Mountain Range. But at the south end of the valley, the Mayacamas, the mountains kind of like go turn into foothills, and then Napa and Sonoma almost kind of connect at the bottom.
Okay.
Oh, just like I said, again, just north of the San Pablo Bay. And then, so basically, and then it extends from the San Pablo Bay all the way up to basically the town of Calistoga.
Oh,
So it's about, yeah, you can look on your waves, whatever. I'm trying to remember in the old days how long it took, but it might have taken, from Carneros to Calistoga, it might have taken an hour at their speed limits. You know what I mean? I forget the exact, is it 40 miles, long, north to south?
and
30 some.
isn't there basically just one road that goes up there?
There's two main roads. There's two main arteries that go north-south in the Napa Valley. One's the main highway, 29, and
Right.
then to the east of that you have the Silverado Trail, which is another. It's a nice two-laner. It's actually it's very scenic. I prefer kind of going up Silverado Trail when I'm there,
Really, yeah.
and yeah, and then both of those will take you all the way from the south side of the valley to the north side of the valley. Okay, and then the valley it's a valley, right? So you got mountains on both sides. You got the Mayacamas on one side, and you got like Atlas Peak and Howell Mountain and that range on the east side. And the Napa Valley is just this extremely fertile, kind of God's country for growing stuff. And basically all the way from the south to the north. You have these wonderful kind of old, this alluvial soils, these nice brown kind of loamy alluvial soils there with different levels of rock and gravel and maybe some clay here and something there. But for the most part, the base of the Napa Valley, the valley itself, you can grow rocks there. Incredibly fertile area. And it was farm. It's, even before it was grapes, it was farming. Prunes were huge. They do figs there. They grew a whole bunch of crops in the Napa Valley before wine really came on board in a big way. So it was already an agricultural area of great repute prior to wine grapes showing up. And then, but once the wine thing got started, it was pretty tough to stop. So
So there's a movie, a big story about, and of course don't have the names at the end of my tongue, but you'll help me, where there was a contest between a winemaker in California and the winemaker in France, right?
Yes.
And the guy in California won. So that was in the Napa Valley, right?
that was in the Napa Valley. That was what they called the Judgment of Paris.
Right.
And this was an event that a young at the time wine critic, Stephen Spurrier, rest in peace, Stephen Spurrier, a British wine critic, put together a comparative tasting between the wines of California and the wines of Bordeaux, because he went to California and was very impressed by what he found, and he felt compelled to do a comparative tasting. Now, I gotta say, the deck was a little bit stacked for California, because the wines that they were comparing, the Bordeaux wines were from very weak vintages at the time. So, they won, but if they were competing against like an 82 vintage in Bordeaux or a 70 vintage in Bordeaux, the results might not have been the same. But regardless, what it did do is it said, yeah, we can play with the big boys.
Right.
We can run with the big dogs.
Right.
And that's what the Judgment of Paris really put in place, that California wine could be acknowledged as premium wine. And from there, it made big news. It was in all the newspapers. This is before the interwebs, right? This is, people receiving telegrams. This just in, Stag's Leap wins the Judgment of Paris,
Yes.
And it created this scenario where, California Napa Valley wine became much more popular overnight. because it wasn't always as popular, in the 60s, and Napa had a little work to do recovering from Prohibition, and post-Prohibition, it wasn't so easy, and it took a couple pioneering maverick producers to really kind of step out and do their thing and create compelling wines in the late 60s into the 70s that the rest of the world had to take note of.
So did the Napa Valley really come into its own in winemaking in the 60s?
It started in the 60s. There were always a couple great producers before then, right? So, Charles Krug was already making great wine. Inglenook was making great wine. Beaulieu Vineyards was making great wine. But your second round of iconic producers, such as Heights Cellars, Robert Mondavi, Stag's Leap, Chateau Montelena, these producers started, 72, 68, right in that neck of the woods, is when a lot of these producers got their start up there. And these were, the cool kids of their day. You know what I mean? They were, it was Harlan in the 90s. It was, whoever. And so they were those guys at that point in time, really breaking down barriers and creating wines that hadn't been created in the Napa Valley before.
So where did these winemakers come from?
Well, the thing is, like for example, take Bob and Davi,
I think it sounded like he was
the
gonna
the family. It was they owned Krug, so it was or what they call CK Mondavi, so and then what happened is there was a familial split, and Peter and Bob Mondavi, they ended up going their separate ways, shall we say, right? And what happened is Peter stayed on and continued with Charles Krug, right? And Robert Mondavi went off and started his own thing. So he created the Robert Mondavi Winery, from scratch, and that's kind of how that all got started, And then he started making great wines straight away. And then by 1974, he was very well established. The Mondavi wines were already of serious repute at that juncture. So,
And weren't there a lot of I'll call them the wineries because you don't call them the chateaus here, but weren't a lot of them, or am I wrong? Were they more production based at that time? Whereas now you see a lot of small wineries, more boutique style. Wasn't that it seems like when you think of the Napa Valley and you think of some of these names you just gave us, that they were more production based at that time, or were they the only ones? Is that why we think of them?
yeah, a lot of those guys made quite a bit of wine, because we didn't have all these small parcellated ownership scenarios in the Napa Valley. And plus, a lot of the growers in the Napa Valley at that time, if they did own farms and had vineyards, they generally tend to sell to other larger concerns, whether it's Louis Martini, as an example, or Inglenook, or Beaulieu Vineyards, or a lot of these guys that could take in grapes and produce larger volumes of wine of high quality, had the winemaking know-how to facilitate that. So it's only upon the success these guys have started in the 70s that more producers, more vineyard owners, et cetera, started going, hey, I could probably do my own thing, And then from there, starting in the 80s, it turned into, well, I'm rich. I live in the Silicon Valley. I think I'll buy a vineyard, right? And then it started this whole wine country, the whole concept of wine country, living in wine country lifestyle. This was something that hadn't really hadn't been created until like the 80s, A lot of the tasting rooms in the 90s, the first time I went to a tasting room in Napa was in 1993, and a lot of them were still, they were small. They were still wood. Cake bread, Gurgich, just these small little winery tasting rooms. It was free to taste.
That's which is that's
now it's these huge ornate tasting rooms and $100 tasting fees, and even in the 90s, it was still like the little tasting areas, like a little hole in the wall, and you got to taste 4 wines, and maybe you bought a T-shirt or something. It was like
that's changed.
What Napa is now is a far cry even from what it was, say, 30 years ago. Very different. Yeah.
Is it the premier wine region of the United States?
Yes. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And it's worked hard to establish that reputation, and I'd have to say yes. There's other areas that are younger, that are kind of nipping on its heels. There's other areas that are, the American wine culture is still very young. we're still talking really, less than 100 years.
Yeah.
We're talking, post-prohibition. There was wine culture in the late 1800s. The settlers, the American settlers and Augustin Harasati and Junipero Serra and all these guys, there were grapes being planted in California in the mid 1800s. But there wasn't really a severe, hardcore wine culture, such as a premium wine culture. It didn't start till even in the 40s and 50s. It was still very marginal. People were drinking sweet wine. People were drinking mixed drinks. They were drinking sherries and ports and scotch. And it really wasn't until like the 60s into the 70s that there was a fine wine culture in the Napa Valley. That being said, Napa got a head start on Sonoma. So because Sonoma, the blend of grapes there was a little different. It wasn't King Cabernet. Cabernet didn't do as well on the Sonoma side. It was closer to the water. It was cooler there. It was not protected by the valley. So the Cabernet had more difficulty ripening. So that's why Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and such found its way to Sonoma. So Napa Valley had all the proper elements prior to climate change that allowed them to ripen Cabernet fully and create world-class Cabernet Sauvignon, which Cabernet Sauvignon, that's the big name. They call it King Cab for a reason. Bordeaux, in Australia, et cetera, Cabernet does very, very well. So that's kind of how it all started up, and then Napa did a pretty good job of making wine. I got to say they reinvested in themselves and did a pretty damn fine job of making wine. They still do. The prices are another thing, but the quality of the wine is the best it's ever been.
So of all the places in the United States, from Oregon to Washington to the central coast of California, other places, still Napa Valley is kind of the king of winemaking in the United States.
Yeah, Napa is the highest profile area. Again, there's lots of other great areas. I love the Willamette Valley for Pinot Noir. I love Walla Walla for Cabernet in Washington. I love Sonoma. I love the Santa Rita Hills. Close to our home team. The Santa Rita Hills is fabulous for Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And all these areas are coming. And who knows? In 50 years from now, it could be Pinot Noir is what we're talking about, and Cabernet no one cares about. Then all of a sudden Santa Rita Hills is going to be the new Napa Valley or what have you. So, but time is still determining that. It takes a while for all this to click into place.
Right. Yeah. So tell me, so what do they grow in the Napa Valley? What wine will we find in the Napa Valley?
Well, Napa Valley, it's all about Cabernet. And it didn't used to all be about Cabernet. But basically, it was mostly Cabernet, granted, even in the 80s, it was mostly Cabernet at that juncture. But even in the 60s and 70s, there was lots of Pinot Noir. There was Chardonnay. There was a ton of Zinfandel growing there. There was Charbonneau. There was, all these different grape varieties were growing in the Napa Valley. And over a period of years, as the price of grapes, of Cabernet Sauvignon grapes escalated, because the producers get more money for their Cabernet Sauvignon wine, right? So you can get $100 for a bottle of Cabernet, but you might only be able to get $50 for a bottle of Pinot Noir. What are you going to plant in your vineyard? What are you going to grow? What are you going to create? If your farming costs are essentially the same, you're going to Cabernet. It's going to be Cabernet, Cabernet, Cabernet. So what happened is Cabernet Sauvignon slowly started overtaking, started forcing all these other grape varieties out of the Napa Valley. So nowadays it's I'd have to look at the numbers. I don't know, but what is Napa Valley like 80% Cabernet now or something like that? Along with some Merlot, Cabernet Franc, Petit Verdot, Malbec, the classic Bordeaux blending varieties for Cabernet Sauvignon. But beyond that, there's only maybe 8 vineyards. I think there's 8 vineyards left in Napa that are 100 years old or more. Everything's newly planted.
So is the price of wine from the Napa Valley, is it a wide range?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. I guess the problem, and is it a problem? Yeah, well, now it's a problem. 20 years ago, it wasn't a problem. Napa was very golden ring oriented. When I say that, I mean, they're reaching for the golden ring. So in Napa Valley, if you thought you can get $50 for your wine, you charged 70. If you thought you get 100, you charged 130. If you thought you get 200, you charged 300. So it's always. And then what happened is, starting in the 90s, you had the cult of what we call the cult cabs, right? The Screaming Eagle, Harlan, Bryant, Colgan, these wineries that kind of, they were groundbreaking for a number of reasons. The quality was through the roof. The wines were a very new, powerful, super ripe, exotic style of Cabernet Sauvignon, and they priced accordingly. They made it in small quantities, and they kind of fermented the whole concept of mailing list purchases and direct-to-consumer purchases, and created this scenario where they became these wines. Everybody wanted to be a cult wine. I want to sell for $200. I want to sell for $150. I want to sell, and then it was keeping up with the Joneses. And then when you have a lot of people in a very small area that have a lot of money and a lot of ego, does that lead to downward pricing or does that lead towards upward pricing? And the answer is pretty obvious. It leads towards upward pricing, where everyone was looking at each other. The neighbors are looking at each other. Well, I'm a mile from Harlan. I'm in Oakville, so he's getting 1,000. If I charge 300, my wine's a deal, right? And so Napa kind of lost touch with the sustainability of a long-term play in a grape growing area. And that's probably the most tragic flaw with Napa. The wines are better than they've ever been, but the fact that they lost, and they're like, oh, we have to charge this or we won't make it. Well, the other 99% of the grape growing world doesn't charge that, and they're fine. So it's kind of like,
Can you buy a $20 bottle of wine in Napa?
not, it's getting very, I'd say just about no. And if it does say Napa on it, it's going to be 25% from other places. So I think you're allowed to use, Lake County or Lodi or whatever, up to a minimum percentage, and then call the wine Napa. And then you can also maybe use a little more from different grapes and call it Napa County instead of Napa Valley. So a little sneaky thing. And but I'd say it's darn near impossible to make $20 Napa Cabernet now. The grape prices, even now, they're going down, but still, I'd say the base is probably $30. I'd say $30. You could find Napa Cabernet for $30 if that's pretty tasty. But the problem is nobody in Napa wants to make $30 Cabernet.
Sure.
Yours is $30. Oh, that's cute. Mine's 300.
Yeah.
And then you kind of walk around.
But is the cost, and I hate to get into capitalism here, but is the cost of producing really different as it relates to the cost of the bottle? Or is it
No.
is it really a $300 bottle of wine because it's worth more, it's harder to grow it, whatever? Or is it just because it's kind of the class, the snob effect, so to speak?
Yeah, it's because what they can get for it. So now but see, that's not all true, because from a basic grape growing scenario, even a top vineyard with quite low yields and using a good glass, good capsule, good label, et cetera, your cost of goods is, $20,
Yeah.
25, But what happened is in Napa, especially with some vineyards owned by a couple of very, very reputable growers, they started charging exorbitant amounts of money for their grapes. We're talking $20,000 a ton, $30,000 a ton, when maybe 10 years earlier it was $3,000 a ton. So the grape prices were 10 times. So when that happens, people are kind of forced into charging a higher amount for their bottle, not to mention the fact a lot of these growers made these folks charge an X certain amount for their wine based on the reputation of their vineyard. So they wouldn't let you buy grapes from them, put their name on your label, and then have you sell the wine for $35, because then their reputation is shot and they can't sell their grapes for $20,000 a ton to the next guy. You see, it was a bit of marketing, and it didn't have to do with the cost of the farming per se.
Sure.
It was how do we get more? Napa for the last 20 years has been, how do I get more? How do I make more? How do I charge more? How do I get more? Instead of what can I do for the customer? And that's a big, difficult problem in Napa, as they're continually making outstanding wines. The wines are really great.
So if I want to go spend the weekend in Napa and I want to go wine tasting, and I'm not the $100 a bottle buyer, where can I go? What should I do?
You have to be careful. It involves research. In the Napa Valley, whatever you do, don't fly into town, rent a car, and just pop into wineries. That doesn't happen anymore to a lot of places. A lot of them are appointment only. A lot of them, their wines are $300 a bottle, so they're going to charge you $70 a taste. They're going to charge you $90 a taste. They're going to charge you $125 a taste, right? This is real money. It can get real expensive real fast in the Napa Valley. So you have to be very careful. So I would tell people, do your research. Research the wineries, look at their tasting fees, see what their appointments are, see what they offer. Because the old days of just driving up, parking the car, going into the winery and saying, can I try some wine? I think a few places still do that, but not as many as you think. Most are already bespoke. It's the experience is curated, and you're going to have an experience with us today, right? So now a lot of Napa's changed. So that's the advice I would give: is just be do your due diligence so you can plan financially your trip to the Napa Valley, because it could be shocking to you if you don't do that due diligence prior. It can be
And
a
if
little
someone
scary.
wanted to go there and we're looking for a smaller price or lower price range, where would they go? Would they go over to on the
Sonoma,
other side of the mountain, Sonoma?
go to Sonoma. Sonoma's fun. It's beautiful. Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Old Vine Zinfandel. Get that experience. And it still won't be cheap, cheap, but I think it'll be much less in the Sonoma side to go have that experience than it is on the Napa side right now.
Well, we'll have to go do that too, and that's certainly for another day. Well,
Yep.
it's almost Father's Day.
Yep.
So tell our families what they should be buying for their fathers and their husbands and their sons.
Wine wise, well, for the
Wine wise.
guys, I know what I want. It's gonna be maybe steak. It's one time I get to grill a really great piece of meat. I live with a couple of vegetarians, so it's that one
Oh,
moment for me that I get to put that ribeye on the grill and so if I'm doing that, then I'm doing, and if you're buying Napa Valley, then, maybe, I mean, I brought a couple things, but, King Cabernet, and that's a Stag's Leap Wine Cellars. They do great work. And this wine's fairly reasonable in the hierarchy of Cabernet. It's like $80 for Napa Cab. That's reasonable. So something like this guy'd be great. Or, we make our own wine. We produce a wine called the Architect, which this is a blend of Merlot and Cabernet Franc from up on Spring Mountain, a very reputable part of Napa Valley. And this is a wine that, getting back to, can you find Napa Valley for $30? Yes, if you're willing to throw yourself on that sword, and we throw ourselves on that sword. So this is 50-50 Cabernet Merlot and Cabernet Franc from Spring Mountain. Fabulous wine, and we sell it for $30.
great.
Yep.
And if somebody is really price conscious and they don't mind if they don't have Napa Valley, then what do you have for them this weekend?
I'd say Cabernet-wise, one of the most impressive wines I've come across recently is and especially for daily drinking, is from Shannon Ridge. They're north of Napa Valley, in a small appellation north of the Napa Valley. They make a Cabernet. I think I sell for around $11. And this wine's super impressive. So Shannon Ridge, they make great Cabernet Sauvignon, great Petit Syrah, and they charge a very reasonable price. That's one of my house pours here at the store for just daily drinking for folks.
Is it available in your wine bar?
Not in the machines, no, but it is available for sale.
For sale?
I don't have it in the machines. We change up the machines all the time, Val. So if our wine bar, there's new wines happening all the time. So nothing really sticks for a long period of time there.
So for people who don't really, like me, don't really understand wine pairing, and they want to buy something, they know their dad is going to have steak. So what does that have to do with wine and food pairing and all that? Tell us about that.
Well, just real quick, because I think we only have a couple minutes, but
Actually, we have five.
we have five. All right, so Cabernet Sauvignon is kind of just considered one of the iconic wines to have with meat, with red meat. The tannins and structure of Cabernet Sauvignon pair perfectly with the richness and the flavors of red meat. But from a wine pairing standpoint, we don't get too hard into it. And you drink what you like to drink, eat what you like to eat. You can drink Cabernet with chicken, sure. Why the hell not? And I tell you, another grape that's super versatile is Merlot. People are talking about how bad Merlot is. Merlot is amazing. And Merlot goes with red meat. Merlot goes with chicken. Merlot goes with everything, and it gives you that kind of like Cabernet experience. So I would say, just maybe not Cabernet with spicy food. If you're having like really spicy Vietnamese cuisine, maybe roll a Riesling, roll a Beaujolais or something. But we're not too we're not too deep in the wine and food pairing. Some stuff goes better than others, but we really want people to enjoy and experiment and have that experience.
If you were in front of a group of people who said, tell us everything you know about Napa Valley, is there anything we haven't covered today that you would want them to know?
Tons.
Give us 3 minutes worth of tips.
Well, just be advised that the Napa Valley is a big place, and there's multiple wine growing regions within the Napa Valley. And what I would recommend as a general recommendation for Napa Valley wines, this is a general recommendation, so I'm not bagging on the valley floor, but I'm a personal fan of the wines from the mountain sites. So Spring Mountain, Howell Mountain, Mount Veeder, these are the mountains to me tend to produce some of the most compelling Cabernet Sauvignon wines in the Napa Valley. The hillside vineyards, the east side Oakville, those hillsides there, very compelling wines. The center of the valley, the wines can be sometimes a bit samey. You know what I mean? Like they all kind of, it's like one big vineyard there. And Howell Mountain, you get peppery character. Spring Mountain can be spicy. Mount Veeder is, structured and a little tobacco-y and beautiful. And so I'd say, as a basic rule, head to the mountains.
And will there be a variety of pricing also?
Yeah, well, the mountain wines tend to be a little more expensive because they're smaller production, more difficult to grow up in the mountains. So, but yeah, there'll be a variety of pricing. But I'd say, it's Napa Valley, so I'd say the mountain wines start in that, $75 range and go up to $500. Valley floor, you can find some wines that are $35, $40. Not many nowadays, but you can find those wines there. So yeah, the mountains are maybe a touch pricier, but at the same time, they deliver a little more complexity and oomph.
How much difference does the winemaker make in the wine production, in the outcome of the wine?
Big. Getting back to it, you spend a year growing these grapes, and bad winemaking can ruin it just as fast as a hailstorm can.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, the winemaker's influence is quite strong in the Napa Valley. The winemaker's influence is quite strong. You'll see different hands producing different styles of wine, and you'll feel their tannin structure. You'll feel the concentration or the richness or a particular flavor profile or a particular barrel producer. The winemaker does have an impact, but I think fortunately maybe less and less nowadays than before.
So for a great Father's Day wine, is it the story? Is it the flavor? Is it both? Is there something that you say this wine has a great story? Got to have one of these.
The flavor, the story. You don't need to spend $1 million, be advised. So it's not all about how much it costs. The experience, and then the experience, and the people that you're drinking it with. That's one of the most important things for me, because wine is a greaser. So it's the stories and the conversations that you have when you're having a great glass of wine that is the real gift of wine, if you will. Yeah.
Yeah, we were some friends that we had shared experiences at a wine auction, and we always thought we should have all signed the corks because there's a story. Some people sign a menu when you go out to dinner together, but who you shared that bottle of wine with is also so many great moments. So do you have any Father's Day stories for us? Anything that brings wine and a Father's Day event together?
Real quick, my dad wasn't much of a wine drinker, and he was a Scotch guy, bourbon and seven, this sort of deal. And there was one year that pretty early on in the business that for me, it was special because, I brought wine for Father's Day and everything, and he wasn't much of a drinker of that kind of stuff. But it was back when, okay, I'm going to get in trouble for saying this. Back when Caymus was good. Caymus isn't very good nowadays. But back in the 90s, Caymus was a very fantastic winery in the Napa Valley. And I brought a bottle of Caymus. And it was fun seeing my dad at Father's Day have his kind of wine moment when he never had it before. So we poured it, had it at the table, and he was like, I could see the gears grinding, That's like one of my Father's Day stories.
I get this, right? Well, our time is up. I'm so sorry, but the good news is that as one of our sponsors, you're going to be back again. We probably won't be back as often as we'd love to have you, but we do look forward to seeing you again. So we want our viewers and listeners to tell us what they'd like to know from you.
Yeah.
Always walk away from our time together feeling a little bit smarter, a lot more curious, maybe a little bit thirstier. So whether you are a seasoned wine enthusiast or you're just starting out your journey, Kyle reminds us that wine isn't about snobbery. It's about story. It's about place. It's pleasure. It's experience, a little bit of history. So you can find more about Kyle and the incredible team at his store at winex.com. And don't forget to check out their YouTube channel, The Extract, with over 950 videos and counting. And of course, tune in next week, next Friday afternoon, for another episode of SoCal with Val, where life gets better with every sip, every story, every bite, every discovery, and every adventure. Happy Father's Day to our listeners and our viewers. Thank you, Kyle Meyer.
Thanks. Take care.